Good morning. My name is Jessica Foft, and I am a clinical research coordinator at the University of California, San Francisco. I run the MTC and MEN2 Registry at our site in San Francisco. I wanted to first welcome everyone and thank you for attending our panel this morning. We'll have updates for you about our registry project, the things that we've been working on, and the things that are to come. I'm going to briefly introduce our 6 panelists to you. They'll be doing some brief presentations. At the end of these presentations, we'll have time for questions and answers. Feel free to enter your questions at any time during the presentations. I'll make note of them and hold them until the end. At the end of our presentation and the questions, Ruth, Amaku, our other CRC, and myself will be available in the booth to answer more questions about the registry and to help with questions about enrollment. Without further ado, I would like to present to you our presenters for this panel this morning. Next slide, please. Okay. So first off, Dr. Elizabeth Grubbs is an endocrine surgeon at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. She's a co-lead investigator on this project, and she'll be presenting to you this morning about the history of the registry and some exciting new things to come. Dr. Julianne Sosa is an endocrine surgeon at UCSF. She's a co-lead investigator, and she'll be available to answer your questions at the end of these presentations. Dr. Jessica Gosnell is an endocrine surgeon at UCSF. She was the T.S. Reeve Fellow in Endocrine Surgery in Sydney, Australia, and she was involved in some of the early clinical trials for medullary thyroid cancer drugs. Dr. Mimi Hu is an endocrinologist at MD Anderson Cancer Center, and she's been a part of our registry project since the beginning. Dr. Maya Lodish is a pediatric endocrinologist at UCSF. She joined our registry this year to lend her expertise on familial MTC and pediatric patients with medullary thyroid cancer. Dr. Susan Peterson is a behavioral scientist at MD Anderson Cancer Center. She is working with us on our very important patient-reported outcomes aspect of our study. And certainly not least, Ruth Amaku is my counterpart at MD Anderson Cancer Center. She's the lead research coordinator for this project. She has worked tirelessly to enroll patients and to work on this project. She'll be available alongside myself after this hour to answer questions about the registry and talk to anyone who might be interested in enrolling. So without further ado, I'm pleased to present our panelists for this morning's talk.
Thank you, Jessica. So I'm just going to start us off briefly with a little bit of a history of the registry. Number one, so that we can show you what an effort like this takes in terms of time, and also because ThyCa has been part of this journey with us from very early on. So really our story began about 8 years ago, at which time when I was really just starting out at MD Anderson as a faculty member, we realized that we wanted to be able to start to look at patients with medullary thyroid cancer in a more organized way, being able to start to accumulate and amass information about this very important patient population. And so we started a hereditary MTC registry back in 2012. This was sponsored by a 5-year American Cancer Society grant. And I was sponsored by someone everybody knows here very well, Dr. Bob Gagel, who served as my senior mentor. We focused on the hereditary MTC because that's what we could do early on, and we knew that we could capture this small group, but I think we all realize that's the rare within the rare. The idea of the registry component, and Ruth will talk a little bit more about this in her section, but the idea about the registry was not just collecting clinical data about patients, but also being able to collect things such as tumor and blood, being able to reach out to patients to get their thoughts on things through questionnaires, and also importantly, being able to look at the hereditary aspect of things and to be able to group families and get family level information there. We also realized how important our sporadic MTC patients were in this process. So you can see moving down the timeline from left to right, in August of 2012, we were able to initiate our sporadic MTC database and tissue bank. Now, this was less than a full registry because we didn't have the capacity to really start enrolling patients to that level, but we were, hold on one second. Sorry, we're having dueling meetings in my house this morning. So we started that database, but it wasn't quite the registry yet, but more to come on the sporadic patients moving forward. So then in March of 2013, we've hit our first milestone when we had 100 patients that we had enrolled into our hereditary medullary thyroid cancer registry at Anderson. And we were thrilled with that milestone, but it also made us realize that we wanted to move beyond just MD Anderson, and we wanted to start to enroll patients on a larger level. So that's when we actually came to ThyCa and we said, could we work with ThyCa to start enrolling patients outside of Anderson through this wonderful organization? And of course, ThyCa said, we'd love to have you. And so at that time, we started coming to meetings. We got to have a booth. That in early days, it was me and one of Ruth and Jessica's predecessor, along with Gil Cody, who many of you remember, who would sit at the booth and man it and talk about our registry and enroll patients with hereditary thyroid cancer. We also were able to work with Amend on that as well through the UK, and they helped us. After that, we then were able to jump up with our registry enrollment to 300 registrants, which was a very big milestone for us and another reason to celebrate. But then again, we started to hit that roof in that we knew that we wanted to grow even further and start to enroll further registrants. And then, so that's why in September of 2016, we started talking about, could we reach out to other institutions with the idea of, if Anderson could enroll a large number of patients, what if we could combine with another institution like ourselves and double the growth? So at that point is when we actually started talking with Dr. Sosa. At that time, she was at Duke, but we wanted to bring up this idea of sharing data across and ideas across different institutions. So that was in 2016. We also at that time started realizing we wanted to grow as a registry and start to do additional things. We wanted to be able to do things like start to make a real registry for our sporadic MTC patients. And my original funding from the American Cancer Society was also starting to wind down. So we had to find additional sources of funding to support our continued existence and growth. So at that time, we started talking with our industry colleagues who work within the drug fields with MTC. And then we also started looking at applying for larger funding opportunities from a granting mechanism. And so we applied for our first R01 in 2016. That had good outcome from that milestone in 2016 and bad outcomes. The good outcomes is that you can see that we were able to finalize contracts with some of our industry partners, meaning Loxo at that point, who has now been absorbed by Lilly, and Exelixis, to help support our registry. You can see that took a couple of years in between when we started the talks and we completed them, because nothing is trivial or easy when we're working with others. And there was a lot of discussion between MD Anderson and UCSF with working with industry. And a lot of that was around protecting our patients and our patient data and what our institutions were willing to work with industry to do. So it was really important, meaningful work, but again, it took time. So that was the highlight. a downside of that time is we did not get our original R01 funding, but that will have a happy ending further down the timeline. And the key we've learned with rare disease is be persistent. So when we got that funding from Loxo and Exelixis, you can see in January of 2019, we were able to take those funds and we were able to do two things. We were able to hire a third party to help us manage the registry, take it out of being kind of a mom and pop type setup to working with AIM, which is our group that Susan Peterson, who's going to speak today, helps run at MD Anderson. It's a kind of a third party entity that specializes in this arena. And we were really able to use them to help us upgrade our platforms and become much more sophisticated in what we could offer. And then also finally, in July of 2019, the contract between MD Anderson and UCSF was signed so that we could really become a multi-institutional registry. This was a really important milestone for us, A, because we showed that first important growth, and B, because we created the contract so that we wanted to continue to grow in the future, we could do this more easily. So this was really the pioneering contract for us. Then really importantly, with the upgrades we were able to make and working with UCSF in August of 2019, we were able to launch our sporadic MTC registry and be able to elevate it to a true registry and not just a database in which we were just collecting data from the clinician side, but also be able to start pushing out patient-reported outcomes and questionnaires, and really elevate that group to a higher level. And then we were thrilled in September of 2019 to actually get that FDA funding that we wanted, which was really putting us on the map to get federal funding for a rare tumor, which was a huge step forward to us. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that grant in the next two slides, but just to give you an idea of what we are doing there. And then finally, just hot off the press this month, we actually coupled with our first international society, which is ITOG, the International Thyroid Oncology Group, which I think many of you are aware of, a group of expert researchers and clinicians who study advanced thyroid cancers and how to really optimize trials in these diseases. And they agreed to contribute to our registry from both a financial standpoint and the ability to allow its members to start enrolling in the registry as well. So we're now going to be able to continue to expand the registry in this way, and we're thrilled about that. So I just wanted to take you through this quick trip down memory lane to understand the time that it takes to really make a registry and where we've come. We are not resting on our laurels. We have a long way we want to go and a long way we want to partner with ThyCa to do this. But I just wanted to take you up to where we are. And now very briefly, I'm gonna, if you wanna go to the next slide, just to talk about what the registry has accomplished to date over its first 8 years. And so that you all know that what your contributions have done have meant something. We do have 26 publications that have come out of the registry. Importantly, many of them have helped inform some of the guidelines that have been used to shape MTC from various organizations. As we talked about, we've expanded from MD Anderson to MD Anderson and UCSF as a multi-institutional entity now, and with the plan to expand to 3 more large institutions by December of 2021 through our ITOG partnership. And then we've secured federal funding through our large 4-year R01 grant. And then just to talk briefly about this grant, because it really is, literally legitimizes what our registry does, that we've been able to work with our federal grouped funding mechanisms and put us on the map. This was a funding, the R01 grant that we received was a natural history studies addressing unmet needs of rare diseases, or what they call orphan diseases within the FDA. And this was the study that we applied for, first in 2016, and then again again at the end of 2018, 2019. And what was very interesting about this is that in 2016, when we put in the grant, we got feedback from the FDA about what they would want us to change. And what they really wanted us to look at is what was the patient's viewpoint of medullary thyroid cancer and how could that help them inform future clinical trials. So we went back to the drawing board and we came up with a grant that had 3 aims as part of it. The first aim was just to describe the natural history of medullary thyroid cancer across all phases of this disease, using a comprehensive battery of demographic and clinical and pathologic variables that we already were collecting in our existing multi-institutional patient registry. And that was a huge bonus of getting this grant, is that we already had this in place. The second aim was to characterize patients' experience through the different phases of medullary thyroid cancer using a systematic evaluation of patient-reported outcomes. This is where Susan Peterson's group has greatly come in and helped. And I do want to give a shout out to ThyCa here, because many of you were part of a focus group that Mimi Hu and I had in person, if we can remember when that was, 2 years ago at ThyCa, where we talked to you all about different patient-reported outcome instruments, and you guys gave us such valuable input about which PROs would work and which ones would not. And we took that forward to use in this grant application. And finally, aim 3 was to evaluate the association of certain patient-reported outcomes and biometrics on adherence change and discontinuation of approved target therapies and drugs being tested within a clinical trial. And I want to explain aim 3 just a little bit more, because it was a novel way of looking at patient-reported outcomes and patients' experiences that really captured the FDA's interest. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this aim 3 that we did reached out to patients that were just starting a new therapeutic agent, a targeted therapy, either that was already an approved drug, such as vandatinib, cabozantinib, or now sulfatinib, capturing patients that are just starting those drugs, or patients that are just starting a clinical trial for MTC. And we're drilling down on this population to understand on a more daily level what their experience is. And so there are 2 main things that we look at on a daily level with these patients. One, we look at their blood pressure, and we send out blood pressure cuffs to be able to access their blood pressure and look at it on a daily basis through a Bluetooth mechanism. And then we also do a daily symptom index that they are reminded to fill out. It's 10 questions they're asked to fill out for the first 3 months when they start a drug, because we want to understand during this time, what are the things that goes okay for them, what are the things that are causing them problems, and that we would want to consider troubleshooting in the future. Again, things that the FDA really has responded to. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of what the registry has been doing and where it's headed. And now I'm going to throw it over to Ruth to talk a little bit more about the registry as a whole, and how you can be involved with it if you're not, and then we'll move forward from there. So thanks, and I will go on mute now and let Ruth take over.
Thank you, Dr. Grubbs. That was an amazing breakdown of the registry thus far over the years. I just want to thank you all for being with me today as I talk about some of the updates to the enrollment as it relates to the MTC and MEN2 registry, also the impact of COVID on our enrollment. Before I get into it, for those who are not as familiar with the registry, I just want to give you a little bit of understanding about what we're doing here. So we're looking to understand more about the natural history of medullary thyroid cancer and also multiple endocrine neoplasia type 2 through current care practices and the experiences of patients. And so in order for us to do that, we ask for participants to provide us to access to medical records, as well as those patient-reported outcomes, as Dr. Grubbs did mention, and Dr. Susan Peterson will speak a little bit further to later on. But some of the information that we do collect from the medical records include treatment detail, pathology details, molecular tests and results, lab information, of course, calcitonin and CEA, and also hereditary considerations for our hereditary registry. My role in these efforts, of course, as well as Jessica, is to, of course, enroll our participants onto the registry and make sure they're completely informed about what we're doing here. So before COVID hit, now this was done face-to-face. Of course, we would see our patients in clinic after identifying them by diagnosis, get them enrolled on the registry if they chose to do so, and of course, send them questionnaires. And a lot of this was done on paper as far as with the medical records release form. But currently, with the change in remote working now, that's what we're actually doing. We're able to consent patients at a time that's more convenient to them. And I say this, and we're able to now schedule appointments, give them a call, send them an email, and now consent them over the phone. And as well, this also does help with being able to send out electronic forms to the patients. And we're doing our part to impact the environment in a positive way. Now let's get into the numbers. So in this year alone, we have enrolled up to 151 participants from around 27 different states across the US, also including abroad in Europe as well. With this number, it now brings our total enrollment number to 1,555. And then as far as the sporadic and hereditary breakdown, there's 1,112 for sporadic and 443 for hereditary. I think this is just very great to highlight, especially in this time when we're now adjusting and adapting to remote working. And it just shows that a lot of people are really interested in being part of these efforts. So I just want to thank you all for that. Now, you may be wondering, how do we identify our patients? I did mention that we screen institutional medical records, which is the primary way we do so. So patients that are coming to MD Anderson or UCSF that do fit the requirements for our registry are the ones we primarily identify. But we do find patients that are reaching out to us through our study email. Those patients are eligible for our studies as well. They will provide us a little bit of information about them, whether or not they're sporadic MTC or may have the hereditary version of the disease. And we would go ahead and schedule a call with them to consent them if they're interested, which they usually are because they're reaching out to us. Now, as far as for family members goes, this is more so geared towards the hereditary version of the registry. And so, of course, family members may be affected, and you can actually identify them through genetic testing. And we do encourage those who are enrolled on this aspect of the registry to reach out to family members if they feel comfortable doing so. Also, we have physicians and doctors and healthcare members that will send us the names of patients that they deem are eligible. Word of mouth is a common way that we do so through social media platforms. And then lastly, patient conferences such as this one are an awesome way to reach out and make sure individuals who may be interested in enrolling on the registry can do so. And Jessica did mention that we're going to have a virtual booth later on. So if anyone is interested in enrolling, learning more about what we're discussing today, please feel free to visit us and we can let you know more about that. All right. So for those who may not be enrolled on the study already, you might be wondering, what are we asking from you? Great question. So the first thing that we're asking is to provide access to your medical records for research-related purposes. This is very important as we are looking to obtain some of that information that I had on those previous slides in regards to treatment history, as well as mutation information, things like that. Next, we would ask you to complete baseline questionnaires. And these are very, very important in that they're giving you a voice in what we're doing here. And they help paint a more holistic picture in what we're finding from the medical records. And so these baseline questionnaires will ask things about your clinical history, as well as patient-reported outcomes and quality of life measures, which Dr. Susan will be explaining later on. As far as yearly recontact, we want to make sure that we are keeping in touch with our patients just to make sure our registry remains up to date. And so we have a form that you can complete as well. Follow-up questionnaires are also very, very important to us because we want to be able to track the disease over time. And we can send follow-up questionnaires between 1 to 4 times per year. It all depends on the stage you're in your journey. So whether you're stable or maybe have more progressive disease, that's how it depends on how we're going to send you those follow-up questionnaires. And the follow-up questionnaires we're able to send them for up to 20 years. And whenever I say this, when I'm talking to a patient, they get really excited, like 20 years, that's really, that's a lot of years, right? But like I said, it's very, very important for us to make sure that we have the ability to obtain as much information as we can over a period of time. Also, biospecimen collection is very important because we're obtaining information, of course, from the medical records, but there is much to glean from biospecimens such as tumor, tissue, blood, and saliva, as it relates to genetic information. And so if that's something that patients are comfortable with, we would ask them to, if there is a pre-existing biospecimens or if they're having an upcoming surgery, we would ask to get a piece of that for research-related purposes. Lastly, for the contact of family members, this is geared towards those who are enrolled on the hereditary component of our registry. And like I mentioned, we're just looking to make sure that we are capturing all those that we can capture on these efforts. So I just want to thank you for allowing me to give you a brief update of what we have done so far. And I just want to say, I've been on these efforts for less than a year, and I've really, really just enjoyed speaking to patients. I feel like this group is very, very eager to share their stories with us. I've read some of the stories also through the Butterfly Sings, and it's just been really impactful on me as an individual. So for those who are interested in asking questions, accessing our recruitment flyers, reading more about the updates from our MTC Registry newsletter, and those who may be interested in enrolling, please feel free to visit us at our virtual booth later on. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Susan Peterson. I just want to thank you for allowing me to speak with you today.
Okay. Hi. The name on the screen says Mimi Who, because I'm a huge admirer of Mimi for many years, but mainly because I had some technical issues logging in today. So Mimi graciously let me use her login. So you have two Mimis here today, which is always a bonus. But I'm Susan Peterson, and I'm a colleague of Libby Grubbs and Ruth and Mimi and others at MD Anderson, as well as our UCSF colleagues, and really delighted to be here today. It's my first ThyCa meeting. And so thank you all for the great attendance and for coming and listening to what we have to speak about. So Libby and Ruth laid the groundwork really nicely for what I'm going to delve into a little bit more detail, which is how we're using patient-reported outcome measures to better understand what the patient experience is of living with medullary thyroid cancer. Ruth, are you advancing the slides? Great, thank you. So when patients are evaluated, for their health status or other disease-related reasons, there's a number of pieces of information and ways that patients can be evaluated. So one is to look at clinical data like stage of disease, response of their tumor to treatment, biomarker data. Another way is to have physicians perform observational assessments, and that's an example of that is by evaluating a patient's performance status. Another way is for patients to provide observational data as well. This could be in the form of physical performance tests, such as a 6-minute walk test or a strength test. But another important way that has been gaining, I think, greater recognition, particularly over the past decade, is with patient-reported outcomes. Ruth, could you advance? Thank you. And these are measures of a patient's physical, mental, and social well-being that are gained directly from report by patients. And so these do not undergo any interpretation by a healthcare provider. It's directly from the patients to however they're being recorded. Within cancer, the most typical type of patient-reported outcomes include symptoms of the disease, the ability to function physically or disability, side effects from treatment, overall quality of life, which usually encompasses measures of physical, mental, and social well-being, and spiritual well-being as well. And emotional status and psychological status, satisfaction with care and treatment, and whether or not one is adhering to or following one's course of treatment. Now, these are, oh, I'm sorry, could you go back, Ruth? Sorry. Thank you. These are typically not just captured in sort of one-off interview questions. They're usually measured in very structured, formal ways through questionnaires. And in the past, as Ruth had mentioned, with our own registry, we typically had been administering these in pencil and paper questionnaires. However, more recently, with the advent particularly of electronic medical records and patient portals, there's been an increasing trend toward administering these via web-based methods, which is what the registry currently offers, and then also through mobile assessments, which we've incorporated into one of the aims of the current FDA grant. Advance, please, Ruth. Thank you. So as I mentioned, there's growing recognition that patient-reported outcomes, or PROs, as we call them, really do add value to both research and to patient care. For one reason is that for a number of the areas that I just mentioned, like symptoms and side effects, the patient is really the best source of this information. And this has been demonstrated in several studies where, like for example, with cancer symptoms, they've evaluated how providers interpret a patient's cancer symptoms versus how patients self-report their cancer symptoms, and found fairly low agreement between the two. So we don't really do a very good job in terms of trying to figure out how fatigued a patient is or how much pain they're experiencing. So that's why patient self-report is really critical to get an accurate read on these. These PROs also have gained value in terms of their ability to inform a number of aspects of cancer care, both in terms of their ability to inform how effective a treatment is. So if a treatment is highly curative but presents an inordinately high burden of side effects, that's an important consideration. And the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, incorporates patient-reported outcomes into much of their regulatory decision-making about treatments and devices and such. PROs are, I think, now almost universally included as at least secondary endpoints in clinical trials to, again, try to capture what the patient is experiencing along with the traditional outcomes such as efficacy and survival and such. And really interestingly, PROs can inform us on what happens as a disease might progress, but also can inform us on how patients' reported outcomes can in turn influence decisions with regard to starting new treatments or stopping treatments. So there's this really nice kind of reflexive interplay of how they can be used both in clinical care and in research. It has some promise with regard to predicting prognosis. And again, for all of these reasons, patient-reported outcomes can really be an important component when in shared decision-making about treatment and other disease-related decisions, and can be used as an important indicator of how to proceed next. Now, more recently, PROs have been identified as opportunities for early intervention to try to lessen symptoms or to try to mitigate other problems. There were a couple of studies recently, very exciting, that showed that where patients who were on chemotherapy for metastatic cancer completed PROs in between visits and at visits for their treatment, and those whose symptoms worsened were followed up on. That group of patients who were followed up on for worsening symptoms compared to the group that received usual care not only had a better quality of life, but a secondary analysis also showed that they had longer overall survival. So this was really exciting, and I think really launched a lot of institutions like ours to look at ways to better systematically collect this data from patients. And again, intersecting with the advent of our increased use of electronic medical records and the availability of patient portals, we now have the ability to distribute patient-reported outcome measures routinely to patients to help track this as part of their care. Next slide, please, Ruth. Thank you. And so as Dr. Grubbs and Ruth had mentioned, these are being, PROs are being incorporated in the ongoing medullary thyroid cancer registry. And this is really just a diagram that shows how we're incorporating our patient-reported outcome measures with some of our other clinical data And so on the left-hand side, the blue boxes show some of the clinical information that's routinely being recorded on patients and that's being stored in the registry. Added to that, in the tan box above, we're also collecting routine assessments of symptom burden. And then looking at the tan circles, we're collecting measures of physical well-being because we know from other studies of cancer that diet and exercise are important both in terms of cancer prevention as well as progression of disease and survival as well. We're also capturing measures of economic well-being and looking at something that has been highlighted in more recent years called financial toxicity, which is concerns how cancer treatment impacts financial burdens in cancer patients and their families, not just related to their treatment, but related to some of the other costs of care, such as the need to perhaps give up work or reduce certain roles within families and such. We're also focusing on psychological well-being and looking at how people cope and how they function emotionally across the disease course, and then also how they utilize healthcare. And for patients with rare cancers, we know that going to healthcare providers who are not specialists can be challenging because one needs to oftentimes explain what it means to have a rare disease and such. So we're really looking at how people experience healthcare and how they make decisions about healthcare. And so all of this, our main outcome is really to understand the long-term quality of life of patients with medullary thyroid cancers. And so we're looking at quality of life specifically focused on thyroid cancer. We also hope that this data might help identify intervention and support needs so that we can start to develop other ways to support our patients, and then also to share this data with other healthcare providers so that they can learn more about quality of life of medullary thyroid cancer patients. Next slide, please. So finally, I wanted to touch on a really exciting area that Dr. Grubbs also touched on, and that's combining the patient-reported outcomes with patient-generated digital health data. So there is a proliferation now on the market, and it's been growing in a steadily increasing trend over recent years of consumer-ready devices for capturing in a passive, often unobtrusive way, information that can provide clinically meaningful health data. And so there's a number of consumer-grade devices on the market for us to integrate with mobile apps on our phones to track our blood pressure, to track our weight, to track our activity. And researchers like myself and our team are starting to incorporate those more into some of our studies and our trials. So within this study, as Dr. Grubbs mentioned, we're looking at whether we can combine a daily, more frequent symptom assessment than we're doing in the overall registry PRO data collection, but a very brief daily symptom assessment along with blood pressure monitoring using remote digital device to see whether or not we might be able to gain insights on adherence to patients who are starting new treatment and possibly decisions to discontinue treatment and possibly also any sort of adverse effects that might be encountered along the way. So this is really exciting. And the marrying of these devices where we are gaining the patient's perspective, but also more objective data is very, really exciting and something to look forward to. And there's evidence that this can be very useful. So there's data from a couple of epidemiologic studies that have looked at use of continuous activity tracking and actually found that higher step count has been associated with lower all-cause mortality, and that lower step count or more sedentary behavior was actually associated with higher cancer mortality. In a study that my colleagues and I in head and neck cancer at MD Anderson recently completed, we were doing remote monitoring of patients who are undergoing radiation treatment for their head and neck cancer to try to prevent dehydration events within those patients, and found that patients who were remotely monitored using devices like a wireless blood pressure cuff and weight scale and heart rate monitor and also a daily PRO assessment actually had better quality of life and a lower symptom burden. So there's a lot of opportunity for incorporating this, and we look forward to the opportunity to share our results with you at a future ThyCa meeting. So thanks very much, and I'll turn it back to Ruth to lead us into our next speaker.
So up we have Dr. Gosnell from UCSF, going to speak to us a little bit more about the MTC Registry Patient Stakeholder Group.
Thank you, Ruth, and good morning, everyone. At least it's still the morning on the West Coast, so we have lots of participants. So good afternoon or good evening. As mentioned, I am an endocrine surgeon from UCSF, and I have had the great opportunity to present at this meeting, but it's been a few years, so I'm so delighted to be back. And I just want to say I wish we were all together, not virtually, but I'm so happy that we're at least able to meet with you in this venue. And thank you so much for your participation and allowing us to tell you a little bit more about the registry. I wanted to spend just a few minutes, really, because I want to be mindful of having time for questions, to go over something that really from the inception of the registry was felt to be a really important component, which is patient involvement. And this is something that it was wonderful to hear Dr. Grubbs go over kind of the evolution and all of the growth over the last decade. And this is something that I think is a work in progress and that we're very excited to introduce, and that's the patient stakeholder group. Next slide, please, Ruth. So if you look up stakeholder group, which we did, because I think it's a concept that's much more familiar maybe in the corporate world, but the original description of a stakeholder group was really from the 60s, and it was from a memorandum from the Stanford Research Institute. And essentially, a stakeholder group is a person, or usually a group, that without that group, an organization would cease to exist. And that stakeholder group can affect and be affected very much by the organization itself, by the policies of the organization, by the objectives of the organization, and the policies. So this slide kind of shows the many moving parts in the registry and the MTC registry, and you can kind of get a feel for what that stakeholder, the different components of the stakeholder group. So we have investigators and staff that have been working really for a decade, building and expanding the registry. There are professional societies such as this one who've been really wonderful in collaborating early on in the registry, regulatory agencies that really govern and protect participants, funders and sponsors have allowed this to be a sustainable situation. And then, as I mentioned, the patient participants, who obviously you guys have been here since the inception of the registry, but we really understand how important it is to now really build out your input and your collaboration in this really important registry. Next slide. So there are many benefits, and in the interest of time, we won't kind of go over all of them, but I think it's important to point out that disease advocacy organizations, many times through online organizations, have pointed out that there are areas for growth largely around communication with participants in clinical trials. And fortunately, a lot of those areas for growth also align with some of the benefits of a patient stakeholder group. So we see some of the potential benefits as building more of a community. Many of the people on this call already have built communities within their local environments and social media, but we want to support that and strengthen that. And we want to work on collaboration and allow for more communication, both within individual support groups, but also between the different kind of spokes on that wheel of stakeholder groups. And other benefits include engagement, potentially reaching folks that may be a little harder to reach that aren't in these tertiary care centers. How do we work on more engagement, more recruitment? And then for folks that are interested, there are also opportunities for helping really guide us in terms of ongoing research. Next slide. So, of course, like most crucial, important endeavors, I think the devil is in the details. We understand how important this is, so we want to do it right. And that means being very intentional, very thoughtful about crafting this in such a way that we respect, for example, time. We realize that everyone on the call is very busy and has many aspects of their lives to focus on. We want to make sure we have the right people involved in terms of interest and focus. We also want to make sure that this is something that is sustainable, not just for today or the year, but over time. And lastly, we want to make sure we have very clear objectives. We want to use what are called our SMART goals. We want to make things very specific and measurable so that not only can we create something that works for you, but also something that we can in a very clear way measure and adjust if needed. So again, this was just a little bit of a brief overview of what we're hoping to create in the patient stakeholder group. We're obviously very interested in comments and questions, and I think I'll just end it now so we make sure we have a little time. Thank you so much for allowing us to present this morning.
Thanks so much, Jess. And I'm going to just finalize the formal part of this presentation with just giving just kind of forward looking where we want to go next. So Ruth, if you want to go to the next slide, what is next for us? I think Jess Gosnell really brought this to the forefront, and I just want to emphasize this. We are always continuing to try to find ways to expand and diversify our registrant enrollment. As we have gotten very good at recruiting through tertiary care centers like MD Anderson and UCSF, and we're going to continue that with our partnership with ITOG. But how do we go beyond that? How do we go beyond ThyCa even for people with this disease who have not been able to find their way to your vital group as well? And I bet we share some very common interest in that, and that you all probably think, how do we get the word out and let others with this rare disease know how to find us? So that's something of constant interest to us. We know that we can do better in that regard, and with a rare tumor, that should be our goal. We should be really trying to reach out and be able to capture as many people within this registry as want to be a part of this registry and want to contribute their voice and their data and their thoughts. So that's one large interest we have. The other, as Jess was talking about as well, is how to include all various stakeholders in all phases of the registry, including design, data collection, study conduct, interpreting results, and disseminating the findings. We have a large number of different stakeholders. I think we all would say our patient stakeholders sit at the top of the list of importance. And so, as Jess talks about, we're just starting, we're at that phase in the registry when we're starting to say we can start to look into how to enhancing our relationship with different stakeholders, including our patients. So we look forward to starting that phase of the registry and working with you all to do that. And then finally, we're always looking at sustainable ways to fund and support the registry. That will include continued looking for funding from granting mechanisms, both at the federal level and other more private sources. Philanthropy, always very important to us. And looking at new ways that we haven't in the past. Again, with rare tumors, I think you have to think outside the box even more than others. And so again, we welcome thoughts on that as well as we continue on this journey.
Thank you everyone for attending this panel. We are so thrilled to be here. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful
Thank
weekend.
you all. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.